Hello, and welcome to Indiana Issues, the online public affairs program where we go beyond the headlines and sound bites and bring you all the in-depth details about Indiana's news and newsmakers in their entirety. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Today on Indiana Issues, the president talks to the Russians and gets all the nation in a tizzy. We'll get some reaction from our panel. Also, recent developments in the allegations of sexual misconduct against Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill. Connie Lawson survives a ballot challenge, and the candidates file their campaign finance numbers, and the money race looks a little closer than you'd think in some places. And so we've got all that today. Our guest today on the program right now, we're joined by our good friend, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Also, Eric Berman, political reporter from 93 WIBC. Also, our good friend, Rob Kendall, in for the Republicans and Conservatives, and we'll be joined shortly by our good friend, Lara Beck, for the Democrats. So, gentlemen, thank you all very much for being with us. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Abdul.
Eric, let's start with you. The president visits Vladimir Putin. The next headline is, "What the Helsinki is going on here?" And yes, I've been waiting all day to use that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, every headline writer in the country had a field day. Yeah, it's a little surprising the degree to which there's still reverberations from this, but there are. I mean, it's one thing to go against the conclusions of the intelligence community on Twitter or at the White House. To do so standing next to Vladimir Putin seems to have gotten everyone's attention.
Rob, you're obviously a big Donald Trump fan. By the way, Rob Kendall also a host on 93 WIBC. Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, your thoughts, your assessment.
Well, he says he misspoke, right? So that's the thing. If you believe he misspoke, then it's a non-issue. Now, if you don't believe that, if you think he was lying, then it becomes a much bigger thing, right? And the bottom line is our intelligence community has had mass failures, certainly throughout its history, most notably recently the war in Iraq, in which those weapons of mass destruction were never found. So maybe he's raising a bigger question, but it ultimately comes down to whether you believe he misspoke or not.
But here's the thing on the whole misspeaking, Brad, help me out here. I mean, it's one thing to say, I would believe somebody would do something versus I wouldn't believe someone would do something. I mean, when I think somebody misspeaks, I mean, you basically say what you intend to say, but you may not necessarily say it in the way that you think. For example, you might have meant to say Abdul's the greatest guy in the universe, but instead you just said Abdul's the greatest guy in the galaxy. I mean, that's a misspeak, so to speak.
I don't think he misspoke. I don't think that was the worst part of that whole weekend, though. I honestly think that some of the bigger things where he says our relationship is worse with Russia than it's been ever. I think back to the early '60s and think, you know what, it's kind of bad back then. I don't know. It's all weird. Do I think the Russians tried to influence our elections? Yeah, probably. Do we try to influence theirs? Absolutely. So it's a factor of what's going on. But, yeah, I don't think that he misspoke. I think that later that night his advisors got to him and were like, you've got to come back off of this and we got to fix it.
Eric, let me ask you, because something else I thought was interesting, too, just looking at some of the national reaction, particularly from Republicans and our own congressional delegation, Andre Carson notwithstanding, it seems that a lot of Republicans are walking that very fine line of, criticizing the Russians, hey, the Russians are not our friends, we need to be vigilant, and et cetera, but sort of giving the president, not necessarily saying a pass, but being very careful to criticize the Russians, but not him.
There's a larger issue here which has nothing to do with Russia, but it's something that I think the party has to come to grips with, which is that traditionally you've got members of a party are either loyal to a set of principles or to the party label on occasion. This is really the first time I can recall where that loyalty has been channeled through a single leader. And that puts you in a difficult position when you feel that that single leader has done something wrong. And you've got a lot of people who have one eye on Mark Sanford and on their own reelections and don't want to end up joining Mark Sanford on a beach somewhere. Okay, I'll avoid the obvious joke here.
But hey, there's always the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah, I knew someone would jump in. But no, they want to keep their job. That said, there's a bunch of threads here. I mean, yes, he walked back the one thing about why would it be Russia versus why wouldn't it be Russia. That's one line out of a 46-minute news conference where he said the same kind of thing in different ways, at length, repeatedly, all of which echoes what he has said many times previously. The only thing different, again, was that it was standing next to Vladimir Putin at the time. In addition, you've got this offer which the White House has since pulled back on, where they're thinking, yeah, maybe we'd let the former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, maybe we'd send him over to Russia to let them question him about what everyone agrees is, no pun intended, trumped-up charges from the Russians. That was kind of astonishing, and Republicans I talked to even today were very forceful in saying this is something you simply can't do. You've also got the one question that came up in that availability, where, okay, leaving the election aside, is there anything that you would criticize Russia for? Crickets. Those who believe that Russia remains an adversary of the U.S., who could tick off a few things in response to that question, that's where the opposition is coming from, more so than that one line that he did walk back the next day.
We're joined by our good friend Lara Beck, Democrat. Laura, always good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Sorry, I'm late.
No problem.
Apologize. I'll make y'all cookies. I know that's
Oh, there you go.
little more domestic and a little more gender stereotypical, but I'll make y'all cookies. I'll make a mean chocolate chipper.
Well, let's get you part of a conversation. Donald Trump, like I said, we've been talking about the controversy over how much of a threat is Russia, et cetera, et cetera. Dan Coates, National Intelligence Director, expressed some concerns, finding out through Andrew and Mitchell on Twitter that hey, Vladimir Putin might be coming to town. Your thoughts on just what we've seen in the news this week?
I feel like my head is spinning on a regular basis, and I don't know how you all feel about that as well. But I do feel sometimes like there's this disconnect, and like every day, if you miss the news, then you have to like constantly stay up to speed on it because I'm always afraid I'm going to miss it. So, I could have missed something within the last 30 minutes. So, there we are. One of the impressions I've always had of Dan Coates from observing him when I worked for example, First Lady Maggie Kernan, she took a trip to Bosnia. And it wasn't a pleasure trip. It was really an opportunity to see what was happening there. And Dan Coates was one of the members who met her on the delegation and worked very closely with her and was incredibly kind and nonpartisan. And so I have never seen him as a blindly partisan person who is going to bow to the leader that you just mentioned. And so I often wonder, is he doing this job because he is so focused on what's good for the country as opposed to what's good for himself? Because I don't know how you could be sitting at a gathering where there are all of your peers, like having an interview with Andrea Mitchell, and find out that the president of the United States, who you work for, essentially has invited Vladimir Putin to the White House through a tweet. And so there are so many just sort of groundbreaking and earth-shattering repercussions to something like that. And it breaks with the protocol that there always has been protocol in government and elected offices. So from that perspective, I see someone like a Dan Coates that we really need him there because I feel like he's one of the few voices of reasons left.
Speaking of voice of reasons, Rob, you're obviously you're not a big Dan Coates fan from some of the things you've said on the.
I'm generally not the voice of reasons. I'm just saying that right now.
But has the president put some of the Republicans like in Congress, folks like Dan Coates, in this sort of precarious position? Because obviously you want to support the leader of your party, but at the same time, next to the last time I checked, Vladimir Putin isn't saying, Mr. President, we'd like you very much. Come play with us at my DACA.
But they're not of the same party, and we have to get past that way of thinking, right? Donald Trump is not a Republican. He's the leader of the quote-unquote Republican Party. But in many cases, he doesn't like them any more than they like him. Different worldviews, different ways of doing things, everything from trade to foreign policy. And unless you believe, and it's such a huge jump because nobody's provided any proof of this whatsoever after almost 2 years, unless you believe that Donald Trump conspired with the Russians or that the Russians actually influenced the election, neither of which have been proven, then this is a non-story. I don't see any problem with us trying to get along with Russia, trying to have some sort of commonality because we need them on so many different levels, from Iran to ISIS to North Korea. So sometimes you got to play a little nice. It's a different way of doing business.
You're watching. Oh, go ahead.
That's one way of putting it, I guess.
Yeah, another way of putting it is that there's ample proof that they interfered with the
Yes,
election.
there is.
I mean, yes, you said, okay, the intelligence agencies can get it wrong. It's 17 different intelligence agencies, and to the extent that we know, and admittedly, a lot of this is a black box, neither you nor I knows precisely what they've got. But what has been disclosed from intelligence intercepts to foreign intelligence agencies seeing DNC material come across their monitoring of the Russian intelligence services, saying, wait a second, they're in there right now, to apparently the latest thing to come out, apparently there was is a source in the Kremlin close to Putin, someone whose identity John Brennan guarded very closely, so he had firsthand information there. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence. Has that jump been made to connect it to Donald Trump or the campaign? That's the box that people are still that Mueller is still investigating, and that connection may or may not get made. But there's an awful lot of indictments and an awful lot of intelligence just in the public domain. Then there's the stuff that we don't.
Can I address that real quick?
Just real quick.
Real quick, because then Connie Lawson must not know what she's doing, because Connie Lawson, along with numerous other Secretary of States, many of them Democrats, said you can't hack the U.S. election system. Barack Obama, who was president at the time while this is going on, laughed at it because he thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. So either they're lying or there was no collusion and no hacking. So it has to be one or the other.
You've left out two things from that binary choice. The other two choices are they don't fully understand what's going on. They don't have to be lying to simply not know what's happened. Number two, there's 50 states. And even if Indiana didn't get hacked, there's 50 states with lots of different election systems. The reports that have come out so far, I think this is in one of the indictments, among other places, to say that the Russians did penetrate and get personal information from some state election systems. Now, there is a distinction, which I think you're making here, of getting into election systems and getting into vote tallies. And no one to this point has suggested that they got into vote tallies. There's a lot of allegations, credibly supported, that they interfered with the election process, even if they didn't reach what I guess you'd consider the holy grail if you were hacking.
And for you folks watching at home, if you thought that was an interesting conversation, you're watching Indiana Issues. Our guest today, Democrat Lara Beck, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Eric Berman, political reporter for 93 WIBC, and conservative talk show host Rob Kendall. Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill, the other big news item of this week.
It was a slow week.
It was a very slow week. Lawyers for the Attorney General announced this week they're looking at actually filing a defamation suit against the individual who compiled information that was used in that legislative report alleging sexual misconduct by the Attorney General and the party who leaked it. Kevin Betts, an attorney who we spoke to this week on our radio program, made several points about inconsistency, saying that they're not trying to attack the victims. Laura, let me start with you on this one.
Because I'm the woman. Is that why?
Because you're in my direct line of sight. I give you the campaign finance question if you want to do that one at the end.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one. You know.
Your thoughts on where we are, because obviously there are sort of two courts here. There's obviously the legal realm
Right, yeah.
of all this, and then there's the politics and
the court of public opinion that
yeah.
I always call it. I always
Right.
say to clients, I always say, I'm not a big fan of the word optics. I think it's a little, I'm just not a fan of that word. I always say it's the court of public opinion. And right now, he's fighting for his life in the court of public opinion. So a couple things, just taking a step back. I think it's pretty clear to me why women don't come forward with allegations of groping and these type of things, because this is what happens to them when they do. And so I find it really fascinating that Curtis Hill is, going on this whole sort of, they're gonna sue, they're gonna do this, they're gonna do that. I think he's going to have a really hard time being effective at his job, and that is going to become a distraction for him. Every time you see his name in the newspaper, it's going to be embattled Attorney General Curtis Hill, who's accused by 4 women of groping them at a bar. So you have that piece. So I think he's going to have a hard time being effective at his job. I think he's going to do whatever he can to hold on. It's become pretty clear. I listened to your interviews on nittypolitics.com with the lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer, but it seems a little convoluted.
Lawyerly,
convoluted how you're getting there. And you know what? The average person doesn't really pay attention to that. The average person it may not really follow that piece, but what they know is that he went to a bar, did something he wasn't supposed to do, and now he's having to address that.
Let me just.
Can I say one thing
Sure.
though, too? What really blows my mind about the whole thing, and I think it has blown my mind from the start, is that generally, when you have these kind of situations, and I'm just speaking from personal experience, it's power. It's you are the attorney general and you have power over a legislative staffer. You have power over an intern, right? You don't go to a woman who is your peer. She is an elected official and grope her as well. Like that doesn't really happen that often. And so that's what I think getting to the bottom of what happened, because I believe the women, but getting to the bottom of what happened is how did he get there? Why did he get there? Why was he even at the sine die party? And are there other women who will likely come forward? I don't know.
Right. Let me ask you, because obviously this
is a really rambling answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Because this is actually this is playing out on sort of two different fields. There's the criminal legal field and there's the political, public opinion field. How do you assess how this thing is going in both those universes?
The court of public opinion, I think, has him largely convicted. I think that the accusations are credible, but he hasn't been charged. And there's nothing that says that he has to step down. And I think he's probably doing the right thing by saying, you know what, let's let this play out criminally. And if I get charged, then we'll talk about it. But right now I haven't been charged with anything. And by the way, I'm still the current attorney general. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Laura's right. He's going to be crippled for the next 2.5 years or however much longer he's in office. And this will dog him probably forever. And it's funny that it was just the week before that somebody was bragging that he was probably going to be on the national stage soon, and I think that that's over. The bigger question will be, if he survives this, will he be renominated at convention by his own party?
That's a good question.
And how does that play out? So I don't know. It will be interesting. I mean, if I was advising him, I'd tell him to stay put, and let's see what happens here.
So, Rob, let me get you thrown in here, because one of the things that has come about has been criticism of the governor, speaker, and the Senate president, saying, yes, even if you believe the women's allegations, no one spoke to Attorney General Curtis Hill. There seems to be some inconsistencies, and that the Attorney General's biggest sort of tool in the arsenal to defend them against this stuff is not so much the allegations, but the procedure and the process around these allegations.
Yeah, if Holcomb came out and made these statements on his own, then it's totally on him. If somebody advised him that was a good thing to do, that person should be looking for work, because there are a string of consistent allegations, somewhat consistent stories, and there's a lot of credibility to that. But the entire investigation is now tainted when the Inspector General, who's appointed by the governor, has to do this investigation after the governor's already essentially said they're guilty. Now, I know he didn't criminally say he's guilty, but he said he believes their story. He's doubled down on that, said they should resign. Now, he's walked some of that back in recent days. I don't know if he's getting advice otherwise that he's not going to comment anymore, but he has really tainted this investigation, at least from what Curtis Hill can put out there, because he said, of course she found that I did this. The person who appointed her said, I'm guilty.
Let me ask you, Eric, about the procedural part of all this. Like I said, you were at the news conference with Mr. Betts this week. Some of the things he pointed out. On the one hand, Representative Mara Condolero-Red, who's accused the Attorney General of inappropriate conduct. There was one story in the investigative report, but there was another thing said with respect to what she told the Indianapolis Star. Some other types of inconsistencies. They talked about how not the same group of people interviewed all the witnesses. They were different people. No one spoke to anyone to get any cooperation. Like I said, the same question I had for Rob. Is the Attorney General's road to safety or staying in office the procedure of all this as opposed to the allegations?
I was following that right up until the question. The road to staying in office
does his path to survival question the process of how all this happened as opposed to directly answering the allegations?
His road to survival has to question the allegations, because if you're questioning the process, again, there's a distinction, as I think everyone at the table has now said, between the legal process of a potential criminal charge and the process, the court of public opinion, and whether you're politically viable. The seminal Indiana case, you're the only lawyer in this room. I only play one on the radio. but the seminal state law case on defamation was a Mexican restaurant in Fort Wayne where the health inspectors came in and wrote them up, and the headline in the paper said inspectors find rats and bugs. Well, they didn't find rats. They found rodent droppings, and they weren't from rats, they were from mice. And the restaurant sued, and they won at the lower court. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not defamation, because would you really have been better off if they said, okay, they found mouse droppings? You've got the same kind of problem here. Kevin Betts, who's representing the possible defamation action by Curtis Hill, was at pains to say, we're not accusing the women of lying. We're not calling the women liars. But there is that difference that you mentioned. I'm not sure politically it helps a lot to say, well, he only grabbed Representative Reardon once instead of twice, and whether it was over or above. Yes, one's more serious than the other. Legally, it may make a big difference. Is it enough to make a difference politically? That, I think, is a tougher road to hoe. He pretty much needs, I think, an IG report that clears him. And I think what everyone is doing at this point, I don't know that the governor has walked back the call for resignation, but what he has done is he's stepped back and saying, I'm waiting on the IG before I go anywhere beyond that. You know, no one's talking impeachment. Everybody's keeping their powder dry. I think the calls for resignation, you know, if no one's actually said this, but if you read between the lines, all of those are, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You don't want to go through an impeachment trial. We don't want to go through an impeachment trial. Would you make this easy on us? And whether because he's innocent or thinks he can beat the charges, or for whatever reason, the Attorney General has said, no, I'm not going to resign.
Go ahead.
What I think is so fascinating is that it's like he's holding on to this power, and he does not want to let go of it, because many times within a party structure, right, you do what's right for the party and you step down. And because you've got the midterms coming up, you've got a lot of it's a very volatile political climate. And so I think it speaks to the challenge as well that's going on within the Republican Party on the more moderate wing, and then you see the more conservative wing, because you've seen some of the folks who have been defending him. Some of your favorites have been defending him, and we all know how their track record is. But to me, it really speaks of this sort of just divide continually in the party, and it's that more conservative wing, and then the not more progressive wing, the more Republican wing.
And to her point, real quick, Abdul, they're reaching a point now where there's nothing they can really do to him, because this is going to an inspector general. It's going to go to a special prosecutor. If it comes out the inspector general finds he groped these women, they're going to have to file charges. So they're reaching a point of no return where you can't say, well, we just won't charge you if you resign. So it's sort of a nightmare scenario for Eric Holcomb, which kind of makes me happy, because obviously I'm not a fan of the governor, which is there's nothing they can do to him. And when there's nothing they can do to him, the theater just unfolds on a whole new level.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, that's appropriate, because as the Attorney General has said repeatedly, look, I haven't had due process. People should not be thrown out of office just on an allegation. Well, the IG, I mean, he's questioning the IG as the person to do the investigating, but this is going to be a full investigation. And after those initial calls to, look, let's just make this easy, everyone's just sort of sitting back, like, let's get some evidence and see where the evidence leads. That may be backwards in terms of how the procedure has played out up until this point. But in terms of what happens going forward, that due process is going to take place.
We're down to our last 5 minutes of the program. We got a couple more things we got to get to. You're watching Indiana Issues. Our guests, Democrat Lara Beck, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Eric Berman, done 3 WIBC Radio, conservative talk shows. Rob Kendall, Connie Lawson, Indiana Secretary of State, survives a ballot challenge this week by former candidate Andy Horning. He argued that because Secretary Lawson was appointed to the office in 2012 to replace Charlie White, that she's limited because the Indiana Constitution says she can't serve more than 2 terms. Election board obviously ruled 4-0 that Connie Lawson can stay. There have been some calls that the law needs clarification. Brad, we'll start with you on this one.
The Constitution's pretty clear. You can't serve more than 8 years. And if you can't fulfill your term, you're not eligible to run. I mean, yes, somebody paid an attorney a lot of money to say otherwise, but shoot, if they paid me enough money, I'd say otherwise. So, doesn't mean I'm right. So I think the election board got it wrong, and I do think that this will probably end up with the Indiana Supreme Court, because even if she's reelected, there will be a challenge to her, and I think it will make its way through the court system. But I think it's pretty clear. She can't fulfill the term. So then we're in a situation of if she can go to her 8 years, then she resigns, then suddenly you've taken us out of the voters' hands to select the Secretary of State after 2 years.
Lori seemed to be agreeing.
No, I'm just nodding because I'm just sort of was doing a little walk down memory lane of the days of Charlie White. So there you go. That's where I was.
Well, let me ask you, Eric, does the law need clarification? Because it seemed to me that it was pretty clear that this was a pro tem appointment. Pro tem appointments don't count. The clock doesn't run against a pro tem appointment.
Which is also in state law.
Yeah, which is also in state law. And, hey, you're in, you're in.
Yeah, the only legal question, the only way Andy's challenge survives is if you say that was not a temporary appointment. The argument was, look, it's temporary by definition because it expires at the next election. If the legislature doesn't like that interpretation, then, yeah, they should change it. But I think what all signs are that the election board did what the current legislature believes the law is intended to do.
Let me get you in here, Rob, as we're getting ready to come down to the wire. Does this mean that the deck is stacked against third parties? Because somebody because somebody like a Jim Wallace a few years ago couldn't get on the ballot, but someone like a Todd Young, one of your favorite
Yes.
Notice how I got all these questions just right to get to the right people this time?
Well, of course it does. Remember when the whole Todd Young thing happened a couple of years ago? David Long and Brian Bosma came out and said, we're absolutely going to address this. This is a terrible thing. We're going to get right to it. What have they done? They've done nothing. It's totally stacked against third parties because third parties are a nuisance to these people, and you're not going to see it addressed. It is interesting, though, that earlier this year there were rumors that Connie Lawson was going to get a challenge at the convention. That person ultimately decided to run for another office, which didn't turn out well, but they were going to use this exact same argument as a reason not to elect her at a Republican convention.
And had that person read the cheat sheet back in November of last year, they would have realized that this is a big, giant waste of time. We're down to our last minute, folks. Your thoughts, your predictions. What should our audience be looking at, paying attention to down the road? What's on your radar screen? We'll start with you, Lara Beck.
I would continue to watch the fundraising numbers. I know we have been sort of watching them as they come along, and I'd keep an eye on that. Especially Democrats, we've got to be as aggressive as possible, and keep an eye on that.
Well, actually, no. You're right, because in a couple races...
Keep an eye on that NBA star in the Senate Majority PAC ad. Let me just tell you.
Yes,
that
I do.
NBA star. He's really good at basketball.
Brad?
I'd say in the future, keep an eye on whether Rob Kendall is sitting in the Republican chair, the Libertarian chair, or the Pirate Party chair. And also keep an eye on the Curtis Hill thing is showcasing that there is a massive divide within the state GOP in Indiana. And Curtis Hill's on the outside because he is of the more socially conservative wing, and the party faithful are more of the big government wing, as Rob has pointed out before. And I think that those two worlds are going to collide here sooner than later.
Eric?
Like Lara, I'm watching the fundraising numbers, but I want to focus on one in particular. I'm curious whether the Democrats see opportunity in the 4th District, which would have sounded crazy 6 months ago. That's an overwhelmingly Republican district, one of the two most Republican in the state, maybe the most Republican. That's Todd Rokita's old seat. The fundraising numbers are very close because Toby Beck, the Democrat, has raised a modest amount of money, but Jim Baird, the Republican nominee, hasn't raised very much at all. Do the Democrats say, hey, we could throw in a quick infusion of money here and turn this into a race? It'd be interesting to see the decision-making.
Rob?
I live out there in the 4th, and I've seen several Beck bumper stickers, which is like unheard of out there, and thankfully it is now Todd Rokita's old congressional seat. Real quick, keep an eye on Trump, because he's at his best when his back's up against the wall, whether it's been in business or in politics. He's the artful dodger of sorts, and always able to come back, from the grave. It's going to be very interesting to see how he responds to this Russian hysteria.
My prediction, look out for in the next couple of weeks. News will probably break us to where the leak came from regarding the Curtis Hill State Legislative Report. So I'd look for that in the next couple of weeks. You've been watching Indiana Issues. Our guests today have been Democrat Lara Beck, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein, Eric Berman, 93 WIBC Radio, conservative talk show host Rob Kendall. Special thanks to all our friends here at Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis for making this possible today. Thank you for being with us, and we'll talk to you next time on Indiana Issues.